Welcome to All About Art. My name is Alexandra, and I'm an art historian, curator, and writer. Within this podcast, topics relating to art history, cultural policy, the art sector, as well as a large range of other art-related topics will be covered. Conducting critical discussions, having entertaining exchanges, or just enjoying some relaxing chats, All About Art is where you'll find it all. Join me in exploring and developing cultural discourse. Welcome to another episode of All About Art. In this episode, I sat down with Ksenia Nouril, Assistant Director of the International Program at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. I speak to Ksenia about the International Program at the museum and what it's like working at such a renowned organization. We delve into how her past curatorial experiences at smaller institutions paved the way for her career. We talk about what the change was like moving from a smaller city to such a metropolis, and so much more. Thank you, Ksenia, for coming on the podcast and for welcoming me to the MoMA offices while I was in New York. Before we dive into the episode, I want to take a minute of your time to mention that All About Art is on Patreon. We are mostly volunteer-led, but in order to cover running costs and other expenses, we make it possible for our lovely listeners to support us, ranging from £1 a month to the price of an oat latte a month, or on the higher end, the price of a Sunday brunch per month, depending on the tier you want to choose. If every person who listens to the podcast signed up for the £1 tier on our Patreon, we would be able to sustain the podcast while also having scope to produce episodes more frequently and expand our activities in demystifying the professional arts sector. So, if you want to receive early access to episodes and behind-the-scenes content, maybe you want to get some merch, or if you just love what we do and want to support us, I would be thrilled if you considered signing up. The link to the Patreon is in the show notes. And now, on to the interview. Welcome to the podcast, Ksenia.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
To start us off, I would love for you to tell listeners about your background. Can you tell me more about how you developed your career? What did you study, and what experiences have you gained in the arts before joining MoMA?
Well, let me begin by saying that I always wanted to work at MoMA. I grew up in New York City, coming to this museum. I remember being online with my dad for the 2004 reopening of that expansion and getting the ticket. It was free that day, and the line wrapped around the block. And I remember standing there so excited and waiting for that moment to see the gallery rehang, which was so radical at the time, and curious to see how the institution was different from the one that I knew, to think that you could know a place so well and yet it always be different and fresh for you is what I loved about MoMA and what I still love about MoMA today. So for me, I'm, maybe one of those unicorns that really, really wanted to work at a place and have gotten to work here not once, but actually 4 times. So the journey was by no means linear. 20 years ago, when I graduated high school, I actually applied to some studio programs. I went to a high school that had an arts program. I was very interested in photography. I did a lot of darkroom photography and black and white and color. And I fancied myself as maybe being an artist. And I put together a portfolio and I applied to a few art schools. And I quickly decided that wasn't for me. It was a kind of, I think, competition that I wasn't necessarily able to hack at the time. And I proceeded to pursue humanities at New York University. And interestingly enough, I had a guidance counselor at the time steer me away from art history because they said artists don't like art history, or artists are frustrated by art history, or I would be wanting to make art if I were an art history class. So I actually was a journalism major, and I couldn't hack that either. The deadlines, the constant revolving door deadlines were too much for me. And after about a semester and a half, I came home to my dorm room and told my roommate about my trials and tribulations, and she's now a very successful curator at a museum in Houston, and she advised me to take an art history class, and arguably changed the course of my life. So thank you. And the rest sort of rolled from there. I was interested in art history. I was interested in using my language skills that I already had, which was Ukrainian, and going to Ukraine and working with artists there. And once again, that snowballed into the 20 years of work I've done in and outside of the region. I then, pursued my graduate studies, got an MA and a PhD in art history, which is a rather traditional course. But, in my defense, I would have to say that I think it's because of also the institutional educational system here in the United States that I dove deep into what turned out to be a 7-year production in getting that PhD, because education in the United States is very expensive and oftentimes very prohibitive. And I'm very proud to have gone to a public university, Rutgers University here in the United States, which I felt afforded me an accessible education, although albeit a very arduous education. But I did receive my PhD in 2018 and then pursued a career as a curator. I worked at 2 institutions as a curator before coming back to MoMA. In between there, I did work at MoMA as a research assistant and
which
a
is
fellow.
why you said 4 times that you've been at the MoMA.
Right, exactly. So yes, I've had 4 lives. I'm on my 4th life here. I started as an intern in 2011, then was a research assistant in 2014, followed by a fellow between 2015 and 2017, and then returned here in 2025.
Yeah, so very recent.
Very recent.
Before we dive into your role as assistant director of the international program, can you tell me more about your experiences as gallery director and curator of exhibitions and programs at the Art Students League of New York, which is one of the jobs that you briefly mentioned just now, and as the Jensen Bryan curator at the Print Center in Philadelphia? I want to know, how did those roles differ from what you're doing now, but also how do they potentially, define or influence how you approach your role today?
So both of those organizations are very historic organizations. The Print Center was founded in 1915 and the Art Students League in 1875.
Wow.
Yeah. So
very historic.
So the Art Students League, in fact, is celebrating its 150th anniversary this year in 2025. Wow. And I got to be a significant part of that in my years there. Similarly, the Print Center was founded in 1915 in the city of Philadelphia and was really a core institution in that city, shaping that city's artistic scene. So that was a huge job for me because it was my first full-time, real big girl job. After finishing my degrees, I left New York, which I think is a trend for people to leave a big city, whether it's New York or it's London or elsewhere on this planet, to go to another city. Note, I didn't say smaller, although I think demographically it is indeed, but another city where they can sort of experiment, learn, grow, oftentimes to boomerang back. And so, yes, admittedly, that is what I did.
Yeah.
But happy to go into the whys of that, which are much more complicated, of course, than they always seem. But Philadelphia was awesome. I couldn't have asked for anything better. It's an incredible city with a unique and vibrant art scene. I joined the Print Center at the top of 2019, so a full year and change before the pandemic, and I really got to see the city in full bloom and got to experience its art scene from the highs to the lows. It was a place where you could in one night go from a very fancy opening at the Barnes or the PMA to an artist's run space that was, very gritty, which is a very Philadelphia word, very gritty and very kind of do-it-yourself. It was a city where everyone opened their doors interest to me, whether it was, the director of a major museum or artists who had studios on the outskirts of town. You never felt like someone wasn't interested in talking with you. And that for me was a really welcome change, having left New York, which can sometimes, as busy as it is, seems sometimes insular. You get into your pod or into your bubble. I had worked at MoMA, so my world sort of revolved around MoMA and what MoMA did. But it was hard. You only have so many hours in a day to sort of go beyond that bubble to see things in other institutions or attend other openings when you have your own commitments sort of in your sort of own bubble. And so Philly really broke that out for me. And I'm so grateful to everyone I met there and everyone I worked with there, because it really opened up my way of working and way of thinking. And the Print Center did too, because it's a very modest institution. I was operating on a few $100,000 a year when that was my budget for my program at MoMA within the larger museum's budget. So the scale was so very different.
Yeah.
We truly had to work very hard and very creatively to think about planning commissions, exhibitions, publications. Nothing could be really done without additional grants. So I learned how to write grants. I learned how to work with grant writers and funders. I had no curatorial assistance for most of the time. So I was both the curator and the curatorial assistant. I was also the registrar. I like to call it a friend raiser, if not a fundraiser in and of itself. So I was constantly hitting the pavement and spreading the word about this great institution, which still holds a very important role in that city's history. And somewhat similarly, at the Art Students League, it is an institution that is rebranding itself. So being 150 years old in 2025, the Art Students League has been a home to so many artists. So name an artist from the history of American art. I don't know. George O'Keeffe, Jackson Pollock, Yayoi Kusama, Ai Weiwei, Pasita Abad, Carmen Herrera. The list goes on and on and on.
I love how you said that, and I was like, I cannot think of one. I'm literally an art historian, and my brain just goes, Nyeh. And then you're like George O'Keeffe, and I'm like, oh yeah, and you're like Jackson Pollock, and I'm like, oh yeah.
Robert Rauschenberg, Cy Twombly.
So many.
Helen Frankenthaler. The list goes on and on and on.
The list literally does go on and on.
And truly from all walks of life, from so many international destinations, the League has always been refuge to artists. It's, an active art school, for those who may not know. It's an active art school that teaches studio-based art classes in the Beaux-Arts tradition, so in which an instructor has very direct contact with the student and can work very closely with the student. And it's a non-degree granting institution, so you have a lot of freedom in terms of charting your own course, whether you study realism or abstraction, sculpture or printmaking. There's no prescribed pathway at the school, and it's always functioned this way, and it's affordable and accessible. You can take classes there for less than $200 a month, and there are no prerequisites. You walk in today and you can sign up for a class and be in the studio. And so that kind of ethos of charting your own destiny and this kind of liberation to explore your own creativity is very much at the heart of the institution. And so many of these artists from around the world have gravitated toward that. And that's what, as the curator and gallery director there, I was trying to celebrate, or I celebrated through exhibitions, public programming, other events, the collection care. So it was really a big, tall order, I would say, for someone who came from a very global background to be at the seat of what you could argue is the history of American art.
I feel like that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I was getting a lot of Black Mountain College vibes from what you were talking about as well. Just thinking about not necessarily the ethos of it, because I think Black Mountain College, well, maybe a little bit, because it was quite artist run, right? Because Joseph Albers was there and Annie Albers, and now I can think of artists, right? But just this idea of when we look back at more recent art history and American art, how rich that is to have these communities and how important it is, and how I think, if I had the chance to go back and just be a part of it for even just a day, I would. And so thinking about the fact that you were a part of that 150-year history, I find really exciting, to think about and to hear from you about that, because I also think, and this is kind of jumping to another little point that's a little bit more practical, when thinking about titles, right? Because this podcast is about careers and it's about busting open and demystifying the professional art sector, hearing what your responsibilities actually are or were under these different titles is so intriguing, because if I think about being a gallery manager, I was a gallery manager, but for a contemporary art gallery in London. And that looks very, very different to what your job was like, and I think someone who's entering into the sector who has no idea what the difference is at the moment, because they haven't had years of experience like we have, I think it's so intriguing to hear about that and to hear about your responsibilities. And do you feel like, what you were doing in both of those roles, do you feel like it strongly defines how you approach your job today at the MoMA?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, those were two really formative experiences that allowed me a lot of latitude. Not to say that I didn't have oversight. I had incredible leadership and supervisors, bosses, directors who mentored me and supported me and definitely pushed back when needed. But they were definitely places that I could experiment, admittedly, because fewer eyeballs were on me and the stakes were a little lower, but nonetheless, still important and still significant. I did some of my most incredible and my major projects at those two institutions. And so I think they were chances for me to step back and find my own voice also, because I was the singular curator in both institutions, and because of their size and their scope, their programming was shaped by that singular curatorial voice. But to those roles, I also brought other experiences, not just like the MoMA experience, so like the experience of working at MoMA and understanding how this institution works, the standards at which this institution works, the kind of, like I say, excellence with which MoMA operates on a day-to-day basis, although these institutions offered me that as well, a kind of high standard of operating and producing. Before I was in graduate school and while I was an undergrad, I had interned and worked in different capacities at commercial galleries. I worked at Marion Goodman here in New York, and I also worked for an art fair. My first paid job after college, my undergrad degree, was at an art fair. And I'm still really good friends with my boss there. I see him at art fairs, and he and I reminisce about the times we had together when both of us were younger and earlier in our careers, when, he led a very successful art fair for many years and is still very involved in that endeavor. So it's fun to look back at this time where we were working for a much smaller art fair, where we were working out of his house. We were in Miami for weeks upon end, really trying to problem solve. And I think that's, for me, every job I've had I approach with that ethos, kind of I'm a problem solver. I'm a solutions-oriented and corporate speak person. So a job like that at an art fair where I was responsible for literally selling the real estate of the fair to art galleries, I was constantly running through what can go wrong or what is going wrong and how do we move that forward. And as a curator, as my career progressed, that mindset was very helpful, because anytime you do a show, whether it's entirely a collection show, whether it has loans, whether it's with a living artist who is doing a commission in the public space that suddenly has a construction site built around it, you don't know what will come your way. And so this ability to plan, but also plan for various eventualities became very helpful. And then now, as I have moved into an administrative programmatic role here back at MoMA, this also serves me in many ways because I'm handling different streams of programming, all of which have their own agendas, their own teams, sometimes in different parts of the world, in different time zones. They have, of course, their own budgets and so forth and so on. So this ability to be solution-oriented has been really important.
Yeah. I think, I'm speaking to a lot of people for a project that I'm working on that I can't say more about publicly. And I've been speaking to a lot of curators in different countries. And everything, they always say kind of the same thing in different words. And it's always like, people think that curating is picking where something will hang in the space. It's researching deeply. It's writing the press release or not even the press release, but like the text that will accompany the exhibition. And it's liaising with the artists. And it's like, well, yes, I guess that's part of it, sure. But a humongous part of curating is incredibly administrative. No matter where you are, you will have to write the loan requests, most likely. And then in a lot of other institutions, you're going to have to juggling a lot of different things. If you're in an institution in the United States, fundraising is going to be a big part of your job, even as a curator, not just as like a director or what have you. Whereas in Austria, for example, or in the UK, it's a little bit of a different structure. But no matter what, like being a curator, and I was speaking to someone else about it, and they studied something along the lines of arts administration. They're back 20, 30 years ago, their title was arts administrator. That was the curator back then. That was what the curator was. And now it's become this like venerated title when people don't actually really know what it means. And I think that that's quite interesting. And that's why it's important for me to like break it down into the nitty gritty a little bit and talk about like responsibilities. I would also, and like bringing me to my next question, I'd love to briefly touch on the responsibilities. And I know that you did talk about like your experience at the Prince Center and the Art Students League, but I kind of want to focus now on your responsibilities in your role now as being involved with the international program. And also maybe, I mean, this isn't really in the questions that I've built in, but like I'd love for you to tell me more about what the international program is and like what it is that you do.
Absolutely. I do want to touch upon what you just said, though, about curators, because I am really passionate about that, not just because my current title does not include the word curator. And I think for so long I was obsessed with being a curator.
Yeah.
At the same time, I was also teaching museum studies when I was in graduate school at Rutgers. I taught a few courses in museum studies and in curatorial studies. And in all of those classes, I emphasized the fact that curators do not make the museum. And the museum, in fact, is made up of so many different people with so many different skills you probably can't even imagine. And without them, the curator can't really do their work. And so, especially when I taught museum studies as opposed to curatorial studies, I made it a point to invite speakers from museums who are not curators. Of course, they did hear from a curator, but those roles and the skills that are brought to those roles are so important, especially for students to see and to understand that there are so many different places within a museum and helping it function successfully. In curatorial studies, of course, you do focus in on the curator, and that can sort of become very omnipresent. But I do remember, like, I'm not ashamed to admit, I was driven to be a curator with a capital C. And I got it, and it was fantastic. And I loved the work I did at the Prince Center and then also subsequently at the Art Students League. And I would say, now I have transitioned into another phase of my career, which I think comes with, of course, experience and also maturity, that I'm not putting curating aside entirely. I'm not turning my back on it, but that I can move into another era, as they say. I'm in my
as the youths say.
Yes, I am in my administrative era.
I'll make a little meme out of it with like a picture of you with like a glittery, I don't know what, like background in my admin era.
I couldn't be happier. And I couldn't have predicted, 20 years ago where that road would take me. likewise, standing here in 2025, I can't predict to you where this road will take me either in 20 years. I can only hope that we can sit down again in 20 years and talk about where that road has taken me.
Where will you be? Where will I be? Where will we both be? Oh my God. We actually should plan to sit down in 20 years.
Let's make a date.
Wow.
You got it.
I cannot imagine. I'm
pencil it in.
I'm going to pencil it in
the diary. Done.
Done. Google Cal. I'll send you an invite.
But I do want to answer your question about the international program, but I want to make sure we don't lose sight of the question about like sort of advice and skills. What I always tell students, which is like, think about what languages you know.
Yeah.
You might have those skills already built into you because you were raised in a family that also spoke this other language or come from a culture, thereby you have this interest or predisposition to learn that language.
Yeah.
Also, just this idea of constantly being ready to pivot, that, you know, you may have your heart set on something, but understanding that like the door is opening in another way and you might have the skill set to lean into that and give it a try. You don't know. You could actually end up making a full circle and going back to what you had your heart set on.
Yeah.
And just the real balance having these different exposures has given me, like, you know, working for an art fair was frankly that my dream? No, sorry. But I gained so much real world, you know, experience and problem solving and being on the ground, having someone come to me in a panic over something that you maybe don't get if you are, you know, more isolated or in a research capacity somewhere in another institution. And, you know, not to say one experience is better than the other, but how you can start to like build your portfolio to bring all those experiences together. Like the more diverse and random your CV can be, I think when I'm looking at CVs, the better you are.
Yeah.
Because then I can see like, oh, well, they tried this and then they tried that. And then that means they're coming to me with a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and they're going to make their own special sauce with that.
Think of your CV as your own special sauce.
TM. Yeah. Heard here first.
Well, I think, you know, but that's a really important piece of advice, because I think that some people, and this is what I did, you know, I also thought I wanted to be a curator with a capital C. Well, when I first moved to London to study art history, I thought I was going to specialize in old masters. And then I thought I was going to, you know, either become a specialist at an auction house or I was going to become a museum director. I then started working at an auction house quite promptly after I moved to London. And I got the job, speaking of transferable skills, because I worked in retail. And so I got the job in client services at Sotheby's because the head of the department in client services was like, oh, you know how to deal with clients and like say hello and goodbye and your smile's great. And that's kind of what we need here. We need someone who will be able to show someone to their seat and who will be open to be checking tickets. And that's how I got my foot in the door ultimately. And that is what kind of propelled my career since. But I, you know, was working at Sotheby's. I realized that being a specialist in a department was really not what I wanted to do. And, you know, similar to you with your experience at the art fair. But what if I had been at Sotheby's and my personality had fit there so well that I had wanted to climb those echelons of the auction house, you know, going from a cataloger to a junior specialist to whatever. And I think that for some people that really fits. And I think it's important to be open to trying these different things. Be open to going to do an internship, or what did you like? One of your first jobs was at an art fair. One of your first paid jobs, I think you said. So like, go and try it, because you're not going to be stuck there forever. You just need to go try it and see if you like it, and maybe you will love it. And then it's great to hear that someone who like is recruiting, when you're looking at a CV, you see that as a positive thing. Because I think a lot of people might be intimidated by it and think like, oh, my CV isn't like clean and linear, you know?
I very much am interested in your personal narrative, and that narrative has to come from a place of your experience, its uniqueness, its diversity, and its frankly messiness. There are many reasons why people have gaps on their CVs, personal, professional, otherwise, and that's okay. but you need to tell that story to some degree that you feel comfortable telling it. And, my CV does not include all my paid jobs. So my art fair job was my first paid job in the art world. I had other paid jobs before that art world job, including dressing up as children's characters for children's birthday parties. So since you talked about your retail experience, I would say this job in high school, I dressed up as Snow White, which if you see me, perhaps there's a likeness or a resemblance there, and I would be the character at children's birthday parties in Manhattan, which is a very lucrative business. And it also gave me a lot of customer service experience at all age levels.
And zero performance anxiety. I bet you can get up on a stage and after that.
I do love to dance and sing in public. Very huge karaoke fan. But yes, that is not on my CV, but it did give me certain skills that I've held and transferred and, of course, honed in more professional contexts that I do have on my CV. The lectures that I give and the public programs that I run, the events that I've even done for the organizations I worked for. So yes, I think that diversity, that uniqueness is really important. And so when you're interviewing for a job, to convey that, to tell your story in a way, the other thing is when I look at CVs and resumes, I want to see something that makes you. I had someone tell me once, actually when I was applying to colleges, think about the applications. And of course, this dates me a little too. So think about the pile of paper applications sitting on somebody's desk, and imagine the window opens and a huge gust of wind comes through the room and the papers get scattered everywhere. And the person is trying to put the applications back together because of course no one stapled them because nobody listens to directions. And your application should be able to stand out so that when they pick up your paper and read the first sentence or a random sentence, they know it's you. And so that's what I'm looking for when I look at an application, whether I'm hiring for a role on my team or I'm maybe asked to be on a committee to hire a peer or to hire a superior even. I'm looking for your story. And so how do you tell your story? And I'm not sure how I've told my story today in this podcast, but
very well so far.
You could be the judge.
Well, I think that's interesting. And to be fair, when I haven't done that much hiring in my life, but most of the time I do print out the resumes still. So I must admit it is, but I don't know. There's a lot of different things that I think about when it comes to resumes. But one thing that I always find really helpful is, and people don't do this enough, but I might not know where you've worked or what that organization's name, or I might not have a specific association with the organization that you have listed on your CV. And even if you think that XYZ museum is a big museum in where you're from, I might not know where that is. And I don't know what, back to job titles, gallery manager versus gallery manager, what does that actually even mean? When you put gallery manager on your CV or resume, it's going to have a different description of the role. And I think that's really important, is to describe what your responsibilities were. Because for me, my gallery manager responsibilities, my CV will look very different because we were in different things. But if someone doesn't know XYZ museum and ABC gallery, and we're both gallery manager, your experience will differ greatly from mine.
Totally.
But if neither of us have a description on there, people aren't going to know. You know what I mean? So it's really important to be this is what my experience was. This has now turned into a complete, what you can put on your CV in order to get a job.
One of my favorite topics, but it kind of goes back to what you were asking me about institutions large and small. And it's sometimes in those smaller institutions, that's where you could really sink your teeth into things and try new things. You can experiment, you can make mistakes, and then you can pivot and take that to a larger institution where maybe you do have a more siloed role. That is the nature of the beast, but yes, you can come there and say, oh, well, I can do strategic planning. I can do budgeting. I can do these things. They were not necessarily in the title of curator as you may know it, because curators may or may not do those things at your institution, but at my former institution, those are the things that I was able to fit into the hat of curator, or insert here any job title, right? So yes, this has digressed, but I guess I should answer your other question. What do I do now?
Yeah.
So I've taken all of these things and put them into my hat, and I've been reborn at MoMA as the assistant director of the international program. And so, yes, I think it would be important to step back and define what that is, because I say that to a lot of people and they nod their head very politely. And I would suspect that many of them don't know exactly what I mean, because this is a very special department and probably very unique in its history and construction. So, yeah, I think it would be important to step back and talk about the international program and its history, which is very unique to MoMA. So, the international program was founded in 1952. In 1933, MoMA established a department of circulating exhibitions to organize exhibitions for travel within the United States. So this was before the time of traveling exhibitions as we know it, where we have a major blockbuster open at MoMA and some other institution in the United States, and then another institution abroad, or shows from Tate traveling around the world, museums that have outposts in multiple countries. This is before that time.
Because you see that a lot, now.
Very prevalent.
Yeah.
Very popular. Successful? You be the judge. But in 1938, that department expanded with the installation of 3 centuries of American art in Paris. So that marked the museum's foray into international traveling exhibitions. And then in 1952, the international program was established with a 5-year grant from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And its first director was someone called Porter McRae, who became very famous for brokering some incredible deals, which included 8 coaches filled with artworks in the 1950s going to former Yugoslavia, at the time Belgrade. So he was this mastermind of logistics who traversed borders and geopolitical situations to get art, specifically American art, to the world. And so he is my boss's predecessor. We walk in his footsteps here in the international program. But of course, over the years, the program has changed drastically. And it very much has responded to the museum and to the world and their needs. So while it is, the international program was responsible for traveling so many important exhibitions that you may know, like Steichen's The Family of Man in the 1950s, as well as the New American Painting, which was one of the first exhibitions to bring work by artists like Jackson Pollock abroad.
Which we saw in your office, Die Neue Amerikanische Malerei was there we go, in Berlin.
Yes, that was the Berlin stop. So all of these international exhibitions had multiple stops, multiple venues, catalogs, and truly welcomed thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to them in their various locations over the years. Now, in the 1990s, the department started to shift. That's when my boss, Jay Levinson, joined the department, and the desire to turn to the global in a different capacity developed. So instead of developing exhibitions that would travel, the department turned into curatorial exchanges and curatorial research. So that was around 1996, 1997 that those interests started to develop, and they took the form of books known as our Primary Documents series, the first of which was published in 2002 on the subject of Central and Eastern Europe. It also took the shape of the Contemporary and Modern Art Perspectives program, also known as CMAP, which was founded in 2009 with Kathy Helbreich, who was at the museum at the time. She was very interested in how curators at the museum could do research abroad and how that research would then, in a myriad ways, affect their work here at the museum. And so it was a program that was established very much with no concrete objectives in mind. So it wasn't geared toward an exhibition or a publication or a series of public programs, but really the genuine interest of educating curators here at the museum and exchanging with curators, their peers abroad, ideas, concepts, visits, so forth and so on. And so that program started to host fellows. I happen to be one of those fellows in the second cohort. We're now up to our fifth cohort. Each cohort is with the museum somewhere between 2 and 3 years, and each cohort is dedicated to a number of different subjects or regions. And so when I was a fellow here, I was focused on Central and Eastern Europe, specifically looking at the history of Soviet art and the Soviet Union, thinking about the way in which that has inflected our own study of our collection, specifically the avant-garde, and then also how it is inflecting contemporary art. So how artists from the former Soviet Union circulate within the contemporary art market, contemporary art space. And that resulted in a number of different trips to the region. It resulted in public programs and also resulted in a book from our primary documents series. So that is some of the programming that we do. We also host an International Curatorial Institute with the Center for Curatorial Leadership here in New York at MoMA for 2 weeks. And that happens every other year, give or take. And we'll be hosting a cohort this fall here at MoMA. And so that's a wonderful moment where curators from around the world, about 14 curators, come to MoMA. We do classes with them at Columbia Business School. We introduce them to the various departments in the museum, and we spend time talking, exchanging in dialogue with one another how they approach their work at their home institutions. Some of their home institutions are private, some of them are public. They have various socio-political, economic factors at play in their institutions. And then we, of course, here at MoMA have a chance to share what we're doing here. And so that's been very successful and is a critical part of the programming we do within the larger international program, which is actually quite a modest staff of about 4 people. So we are modest but mighty in our efforts as administrators, because that's what we all are. We are, the department no longer circulates exhibitions. There are no longer registrars or curators assigned to this department. So we truly are uplifting and amplifying, is what I like to say, uplifting and amplifying the work of our colleagues here throughout the museum, and also, frankly, the world, because those interpersonal relationships and those connections that we believe are long-term and sustainable are truly the bread and butter of what we do. I
want to ask you also about your priorities and responsibilities within your team. You mentioned that you're a mighty, what did you say? A modest and mighty team.
Modest but mighty.
Modest but mighty team of 4. How does your role interact with others within the museum? And, not just your team, but also maybe the museum in general, because I just find it interesting to speak about the broader infrastructure due to the sheer size and notability of the institution that we're sitting in today.
Yeah, so we have 4 on the team of the international program. We also have 3 fellows as we run the research program known as CMAP. And those 3 research fellows are experts in their field, in this case, in art of the African continent, Southeast Asia, and India, specifically the city of Mumbai. And so those fellows also are part of our department, but they are seated in curatorial departments and also report to curators within those departments. So they interact with me and interact with the team in the international program, but also they interact with their curatorial departments, with their curators, with their curatorial teams, and all of the machinations of the curatorial departments, acquisitions, programs, and so forth and so on. I would say, my interactions with my team and with the fellows are based on their research, on our meetings, which focus on welcoming scholars, artists, and experts from those regions to the museum for these internal lectures, which is how this training or knowledge building, knowledge exchanging program works here. Within the larger scope of the museum, I would say I like to follow what I call presence and persistence, which is you will see me wherever I can be, as much as I can be, as often as I can be. So here at the museum, we have different groups. We have 3 curatorial working groups, and I'm a part of all 3 of them. And By a part, I mean I attend those meetings, and at those meetings, I represent the international program, and I represent our CMAP program, and I represent the global research that is going on at this institution. I feel very much that, my colleagues reciprocate that, because so many of them are engaged in that global research. They are part of our research program. They come to our meetings. They travel with us. They benefit from our resources, and we, benefit from their enthusiasm and their programming through exhibitions and publications and so forth and so on. So I just find it really important to be there, because sometimes, if you're not there, you don't have a say in what's happening. And rightfully so, people might forget about you. And so it's just very important to be present and persistent. We also have a cataloging task force here at the institution, which we engage in questions around cataloging artworks. And that's also a really fascinating discussion that I enjoy being a part of. So I find if I can be a part of it here at MoMA, sign me up for it. I am here for it.
I love that. Ksenia, finally, a fun question to end the episode that I ask all of my guests. If you could pick one artist from art history to have dinner with, who would it be and why?
So I think I have actually answered this question before for ArtNet. And at the time, I said the Venus of Willendorf, because she's so mysterious, yet so foundational. You literally cannot open up an art history textbook without seeing her in it as this prime example. And my Art History 101 class with Catherine Smith at NYU, if you're listening, was clearly very transformative. And that was one of the works we studied. And, you don't know much about who made the Venus of Willendorf, who she is. I mean, more recent studies of her suggest that it was a self-portrait.
Yeah, of a woman looking down at herself.
Yeah. And
right? Looking at her body, not in a mirror.
Exactly. And so this idea of all bodies, many bodies, other kinds of bodies, depicting you coming as you are, for me, are all really wonderful sentiments that work encompasses. And, even a good friend of mine recently gifted me a replica, actually a to-scale replica made in Portugal, which I keep at my desk here at MoMA as a kind of reminder and talisman of, the good and the bad, right? The ups and the downs, the known and the unknown. I think so much of the work I do here with the international program at MoMA is about, exchange and knowledge, generation and knowledge exchange. And so this kind of curiosity that the Venus of Willendorf, I think, has for us is encapsulated in the kind of work I do. But, of course, art history is ripe for the picking, and there could be so many different artists to choose from, especially these days with, revisionist histories and parallel histories being so important. So, looking back at my own journey, I think I could also say someone like maybe Maria Primachenko, who was an artist in Ukraine active from the 1930s until her death in the 1990s, could be also a really interesting dinner guest. She was a self-taught artist. She was interested in craft and textile, but also a painter, and worked on paper as well. And she was recently the subject of a large exhibition at the Ukrainian Museum here in New York. But, a lot of her works were recently destroyed in Ukraine as a result of the full-scale invasion and the war in Ukraine. And so it, for me, marks an archive and a story that we know but may never fully know as well. And to sit with her and to have a meal with her could be really inspiring to understand the depth and the breadth of her practice.
That is a wonderful answer. Thank you so much for sitting down with me today, for sharing your expertise, for answering all of my questions, and for welcoming me to MoMA.
You are very welcome. This has been a pleasure, and I probably could have said other things or more things, or I'm going to remember as I'm falling asleep tonight. But needless to say, this was such an honor, and I hope we can get together in 20 years. Maybe here at MoMA, hopefully, for a second part of this conversation.
We'll put it in the calendar. And that is it for today on All About Art. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave me a rating or a review, as it helps more people discover the show. Also, feel free to share with your friends, or if you share on social media, tag me and get in touch. Thank you so much for listening.